The deployment of U-28A Special Operations aircraft to the North Sea is not a show of force. It is a symptom of terminal decline. While legacy media focuses on the missile, the overt kinetic threat to a single Russian tanker, they are directing your attention away from the actual vector of attack. The real weapon is not an explosion, it is silence. The primary threat to the Western Bloc is no longer a symmetric military exchange. It is a systemic information blackout. Russia and CSIS have modeled this scenario for years. The true targets are the undersea fiber optic cables, the literal nervous system of global finance, and the orbital satellites that provide cryptographic timing signals for every transaction. The objective is not asset destruction, but the induction of paralysis. This is the Blind Leviathan Protocol. By severing these data conduits, an adversary renders the Western financial system functionally blind and immobile. Without data, there is no SWIFT, no market clearing, no credit validation. The entire apparatus of economic leverage freezes instantly. It is a non-kinetic kill switch for a system that has become a hollowed-out shell, its solvency eroded. When a state's economic toolkit fails, as evidenced by Germany's central planning death spiral and the systemic erosion of trust in the USD, it must default to a different protocol. It must treat every minor economic challenge as a potential trigger for total system collapse. The U-28As are not hunting a tanker. They are hunting the assets capable of flipping the switch, transforming a financial liability into a military launch-on-warning posture. This is asymmetric escalation, the mathematical certainty of a dying empire. The motive is not ideology. It is insolvency. A state that can no longer afford its own balance sheet must export the cost of its decay. According to CSIS analysis, prolonged, unpopular foreign wars are engineered to transform domestic liabilities, like untenable pension obligations or sovereign debt, into a kinetic event abroad. The war is not a foreign policy choice. It is a solvency crisis packaged as a crusade. This is a systemic failure protocol. The evidence is irrefutable. In Germany, Chancellor Friedrich Merz warns of a severe economic crisis, yet the only response is to double down on the central planning that created it. This is a policy death spiral. As noted by Bloomberg, the official narrative is no crash, no problem, a dangerous fiction obscuring the reality of systemic breakdown. Simultaneously, the foundational leverage of the West, the US dollar, is experiencing terminal trust erosion. As financier Ray Dalio warns, the surge in gold is a direct measure of collapsing faith in the USD. When your financial weapons are neutralized, you are forced to unsheath your kinetic ones. This is the pivot to asymmetry. Weakness forces this hand. A solvent power uses economic tools. An insolvent power cannot. It must meet a minor challenge with a disproportionate threat. This is why U.S. Air Force Special Operations aircraft are postured over the North Sea in response to a single oil tanker. The tanker is an economic liability. The response is a kinetic threat. This is not strength. It is a launch-on-warning posture dictated by economic desperation. The core of this strategic shift is pure economics. The Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, has modeled the lethal exchange rate. It is no longer symmetrical. A $5 million main battle tank can now be neutralized by a $500 FPV drone. This isn't an anomaly. It is the new calculus of conflict. The return on investment for kinetic action has inverted. The defender's solvency is bled dry, one cheap attack at a time. This is what high-level intelligence refers to as the democratization of violence. The term is clinical. It signifies that the capacity to destroy high-value state assets is no longer a monopoly held by solvent, industrialized nations. The barrier to entry for projecting lethal force has collapsed. This creates an infinite number of potential threats, turning every expensive Western military platform into a latent economic liability. a high-value target awaiting a low-cost trigger. The mathematical certainty of this unfavorable exchange rate forces a launch-on-warning protocol. You cannot afford to trade assets in a crisis where your kinetic cost is 10,000 times higher than the adversary's. Therefore, the presence of U.S. Special Operations aircraft over the North Sea is not a flexing of military muscle. It is a preemptive escalation, designed to intimidate a low-cost actor before they can impose a high-cost reality. It is the signature of a declining power forced to use the threat of disproportionate force to protect assets it can no longer afford to lose. The zones of conflict are no longer defined by traditional borders. They are now defined by financial liability. To locate the next trigger point, you do not look at a political map. You look for the proxy laboratories, regions designated as test beds for a new doctrine. Analysts at RUSI identify these as gray zones, often regions rich in resources but suffering from systemic instability. Recent travel warnings and capital controls in various peripheral states are not the cause of global tension. They are the symptoms of a staging ground. They are the controlled environment where new protocols are tested. In these labs, minor economic events, a currency devaluation, a local supply chain disruption, are intentionally met with disproportionate security responses. This is not a mistake. It is the calculated calibration of an asymmetric escalation protocol, designed to measure the precise kinetic cost required to neutralize a financial threat. Once the protocol is perfected in the low-visibility gray zone, it is graduated to a core theater. The systemic decay documented in Germany, a feedback loop of failed central planning, and the documented erosion of trust in the USD are the preconditions. They create the solvency crisis. This brings us to the North Sea. The deployment of U-28A Draco Special Operations aircraft is not a standard naval patrol. It is the direct application of the Gray Zone Protocol. The Russian tanker represents an economic liability, a challenge to energy market control. The response is not diplomatic. It is a pre-calibrated, launch-on-warning kinetic threat. This is the blueprint. The distinction between a nation's treasury and its Defense Department has been erased. The next theater of operations will not be announced by generals, but by a balance sheet. Any state exhibiting significant economic fragility is now a candidate for designation as a gray zone, a live fire range for economic warfare. The launch-on-warning protocol is not an act of aggression. It is a mathematical function of weakness. The doctrine dictates that if early warning systems, satellites, ground-based radar, detect an inbound nuclear strike, a retaliatory launch is executed. Before the incoming warheads detonate, there is no waiting for confirmation. The system is designed to preempt a decapitation strike that would eliminate the capacity to respond. This protocol transforms information into the primary strategic asset. The problem is the fog of digital war. A sophisticated cyber attack does not need to launch a missile. It only needs to blind the radar. It creates ambiguity. Is the signal loss a solar flare, a system malfunction, or is it the deliberate blinding that precedes a full-scale launch? In this scenario, the commander has seconds. But the commander does not make the decision. The protocol does. The doctrine is a pre-loaded command. If the state cannot verify the integrity of its own senses, it must assume the worst-case scenario. The fear of being annihilated while waiting for clarity forces the launch. Hesitation is a variable the system is designed to eliminate. This is the kinetic cost of a solvency crisis. A nation with robust economic resilience can afford to absorb a hit and retaliate. A state facing systemic decay, where leaders like Germany's Chancellor warn of economic collapse, cannot. Source number 3. It lacks the financial depth to rebuild. Its survival becomes a zero-sum game dependent on preemption. CCS reports confirm that command and control networks are primary targets for state-level cyber attacks. When trust in your own currency is eroding, source number 4, and your only remaining leverage is kinetic, You cannot afford digital blindness. The commander is no longer a human. They are an executor of a pre-authorized sequence, triggered by an absence of data. The cyber attack doesn't just open the door, it forces the launch. The shift from economic leverage to kinetic threat is not a choice. It is a mathematical function of systemic decay. As German chancellors warn of economic collapse while doubling down on the failing policies causing it, and as institutional analysts like Ray Dalio chart the terminal erosion of USD trust, the solvency crisis becomes acute. The toolkit is empty. The primary leverage of the Western system, its financial dominance, is becoming a liability. This forces the adoption of a new protocol: asymmetric escalation. Minor economic challenges must now be met with disproportionate military posturing to maintain credibility. The recent movement of U.S. Air Force U-28A, Draco Special Operations aircraft toward the North Sea, is the blueprint in motion. These are not patrol planes. They are platforms for non-conventional warfare. Their deployment over a single Russian tanker is a deliberate overreaction, a field test for converting an economic friction point into a military trigger. A threat doctrine is useless without a credible demonstration. A calibration shot is required to signal capability and intent without triggering a full-spectrum response. This event must be attribution impossible, delivering a message only to its intended audience. We forecast, within the next 9 to 12 months, a cascading infrastructure failure at a Tier 1 Northern European data and shipping nexus. The event will present as a simultaneous multi-system blackout, crippling port logistics and regional data centers. It will be publicly framed as a novel cyber-physical attack from a non-state actor. Its actual purpose is to establish the new kinetic cost of business.